I opened my front door at 11 o'clock at night. The porch light fell across Nora's face, blonde curls loose and messy, eyes faintly red, both hands clutching a brown leather bag against her chest, like she was holding something breakable. She stood on the step and didn't come in, just looked at me and said, "I got into a fight with my brother. I know it's late, but can I stay until morning?" I nodded, stepped aside. She crossed the threshold, and the jasmine from the neighbor's garden drifted in behind her. I didn't know it then, but that night changed everything. My name is Caleb Merritt. I'm 36 years old, and I restore antique furniture for a living in Savannah, Georgia. My workshop is in the garage of the craftsman house I've owned for 7 years now, on Abercorn Street, under a canopy of live oaks that drop moss onto my truck every morning, like the trees are trying to gift wrap it. I take in tables and chairs from the 1920s through the 1950s pieces that have survived wars and floods and estate sales and ended up warped, cracked, stripped of their dignity. I sand them down, repair the joinery, lay on fresh coats of varnish, and send them back out into the world looking like they never gave up. The smell of tung oil is in everything I own, my shirts, my truck seats, the calluses on my palms. I've been doing this for 11 years, ever since I dropped out of a business degree at Georgia Southern and realized I'd rather fix something real than sell something imaginary. I was married for 4 years to a woman named Diane. Diane was loud not in volume, but in presence. She needed the living room full of people. She needed brunch reservations and weekend plans mapped out by Wednesday. She needed constant proof that I was engaged, that I was trying, that I was enough of something she never quite defined. I loved her in the beginning. Then I loved the idea of her. Then I just loved the silence she left behind when she finally walked out. We divorced 2 years before the night Nora came to my door. No children. She moved to Atlanta and took the noise with her. I stayed in the house on Abercorn Street and settled into a rhythm so slow it barely had a pulse. Mornings sanding wood, afternoons making deliveries across the county, evenings sitting on the front porch with a cold beer and a paperback, and the sound of the street doing absolutely nothing. I wasn't lonely in a way that deserved sympathy. I was just quiet, and I'd been quiet so long that a doorbell at 11 o'clock at night sounded like a small explosion going off inside my chest. Nora Ashford moved into the house 2 doors down about a year before that night. She was a freelance book editor, worked from home, rarely went out, spent most of her afternoons on her own porch, with a laptop and a ceramic mug of tea. We got to know each other the way neighbors do in Savannah. A wave over the iron fence, small talk when it rained hard enough to flood the gutters, and every now and then she'd bring over a box of shortbread cookies and say, made too many, didn't want them going to waste. But we never went further than that. She had a brother named Marcus who lived out on Tybee Island, drove a beat-up Jeep, and came around on weekends sometimes, and that was about all I knew about her life. There was one small detail I didn't catch until much later. Every time Nora came over for tea, for a quick hello on the porch, for any reason at all, she drank from the same cup, a white porcelain mug with a thin blue rim around the lip. I used to keep it on the top shelf of the cabinet because nobody ever reached for it. Then one day I noticed it had moved. It was sitting right there at eye level, within easy reach, like it had always been there. And I realized I was the one who'd moved it. I just couldn't remember when. Couldn't remember deciding to. My hands had made the decision without asking my brain. She never asked me about Diane. Not once. And that the not asking was the thing that made me most comfortable around her. Most people hear you're divorced and treat you like a crime scene. They want the timeline, the details, the blame. Nora just let the silence sit where it was. She let me be the version of myself that existed after, not the one who'd failed before. And on those evenings when I'd sit on my porch and see the yellow glow of her window through the trees, steady and warm like a lighthouse I didn't know I was steering toward, I'd think, maybe quiet isn't empty. Maybe it's just waiting for the right person to be quiet with. That night, after Nora stepped inside, I walked to the kitchen and made tea without asking what she wanted. I reached for the white mug with the blue rim, didn't think about it. Just muscle memory. The kind your hands develop before your brain catches up. I set it in front of her on the table. She looked at the mug, then looked at me, paused for one beat, and said, "Thank you." Her voice was steady but thin, like a wire strung just tight enough to hum. She told me about the fight with Marcus, He wanted her to move back to Portland, closer to their parents. Their mother had been having health scares, nothing critical, but the kind of phone calls that make you reconsider how far away you really are. Marcus thought Nora should be there. She didn't want to go. But when she told me all of this, her voice wasn't angry. It was tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from carrying something heavy. It comes from holding something too long without ever setting it down. I set up the living room couch for her, pulled a blanket from the hall closet, grabbed a pillow from my own bed. She started to say, "You don't have to," and I cut her off. "Nobody has to do anything. Just get some sleep." I went to my room, closed the door, and lay on my back staring at the ceiling fan, making its slow, lazy circles in the dark. That was the first time in 2 years that another person's breathing had filled this house. I could hear it faintly through the wall, soft, slow, settling in like the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath. And I lay there thinking about how strange it was that a sound so small could make 3 bedrooms and a kitchen feel like an entirely different place. The next morning I was up before the sun had finished climbing over the rooftops. Made coffee, strong and black. Nora had already folded the blanket into a perfect square, placed the pillow back precisely where it belonged, and washed her mug, set it upside down on the shelf. Still damp, she was sitting on the front porch with her hair pulled back in a loose knot, scrolling through something on her phone. When she heard the screen door, she looked up and said, "I'm sorry about last night." I said, "Don't be." She nodded once, gave me a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and walked home. The house went quiet again, but a different kind of quiet, the kind that knows someone was just there, the kind that holds a shape. Over the weeks that followed, Nora started coming around more often. She'd bring a manuscript she was editing, and ask my opinion on a passage as if a man who spends his days breathing sawdust has anything useful to say about contemporary fiction. She'd drop off leftovers from dinners she'd made for one. Sometimes she'd just sit on my porch with her book and her tea and read for an hour while I worked in the garage 20 feet away. She never offered a reason for being there. I never asked for one, but I noticed something. She always picked the chair closest to the workshop door, the one where the rhythm of the sandpaper and the sharp, clean smell of freshly cut wood carried clearest. I told myself she just liked the quiet out here, that my porch was shaded better than hers, that the chair was more comfortable. It didn't occur to me, not once, that she was choosing to be near me specifically, that the quiet she wanted wasn't just any quiet. It was mine. One afternoon I was restoring a walnut table from around 1940. Gorgeous piece, solid legs, hand-carved apron, but the surface was scarred deep from decades of use. Nora was standing beside my workbench, watching my hands move the sandpaper in long passes. She asked, "Do you ever keep the old scratches?" I told her I did when I could, because the scratches are history. Sand them all away, and the table loses its memory, becomes a beautiful piece of wood with absolutely nothing to say. Nora went quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that I looked up. Then she said softly, almost to herself, "I like the way you think about that." Her voice, when she said it, was different, lower, more careful, like she was placing something delicate into my hands and watching to see if I'd hold it right. I didn't know what to call that tone, but I filed it away in the part of my brain that stores things it hasn't figured out yet. She noticed things, small things. Nora knew I drank my coffee black. No sugar, never once asked, just poured it right every time, like she'd memorized the answer to a question she'd never spoken. She knew I was allergic to hazelnuts because one afternoon she brought over a batch of cookies, stopped dead at my front door, and said, "Wait, do these have hazelnuts in them?" Then she turned around and took them home without another word. The next day she came back with a different batch. No apology, no big production. She just remembered things I didn't even remember telling her, and every one of those quiet little rememberings landed like a pebble dropped into still water, barely any sound at all, but ripples moving outward, slow and wide. One morning, my neighbor Ellen, 72 years old, sharp as a blade, been living on this street longer than most of the oak trees, spotted Nora walking out through my front gate early one morning. Ellen looked at Nora, then at me standing in the doorway in my undershirt and jeans, and her face said everything. I started stumbling into some explanation. She just needed a place to stay. It isn't what it looks like, and Ellen held up one hand and said, "You don't need to explain a thing to me, Caleb." Then she walked back to her azalea beds, and I stood there wondering, Does everyone on this street see something I'm still blind to? One evening, Nora stayed later than usual. We sat on the porch while the last of the daylight faded and the street lamps buzzed on one by one down the block. The crickets were so loud it felt like the entire neighborhood was breathing with a single set of lungs. She told me about her parents in Portland, her father's woodworking hobby that he never took seriously enough, her mother's tomato garden that took over half the backyard every summer like a small green revolution. She told me she chose Savannah because she wanted to live somewhere slow enough to hear herself think. Then she turned to me, and I remember the way the porch light caught the edge of her jaw, the way her eyes looked darker and deeper in the half-shadow, and asked, "Do you ever get lonely?" I said, "Yes, but not right now." She didn't respond, just looked out at the empty street, and I saw her fingers tighten, slowly, around the cuff of her cardigan sleeve like she was holding herself back from reaching toward something she wasn't ready to name. She never once said, "I like you," didn't say, never made a move, never crossed a line, never pushed past what was comfortable. She just kept showing up, and the weight of her showing up day after day, week after week, always the same chair near the workshop, always the same mug, always that quality of silence that felt more like a long conversation than words ever could. That weight was heavier than any declaration I've ever heard. I started noticing that I opened the workshop later on mornings she didn't come by. Not because I was lazy, because there was simply less reason to begin. The ice in her tea glass dissolving one sliver at a time, the smell of walnut dust hanging in the warm afternoon air between us, the porch light catching her blonde hair in the evening warmer than it looked in daylight, almost gold, almost something I could reach out and hold. These are the things I remember from that slow, accumulating season. Not speeches, not confessions, just presence, layering quietly, the way varnish builds on wood one coat at a time, each one invisible on its own, until the surface begins to glow. Diane showed up without warning on a Saturday afternoon. I was across town delivering the walnut table to a client in Ardsley Park when I pulled back into my driveway and saw her silver sedan parked at the curb. Same car, same Georgia plates, same faded bumper sticker she'd never bothered to peel off. She was sitting on my front porch with her legs crossed, holding a glass of water she'd poured herself from my kitchen like she still had a claim on every room. She told me she was in Savannah visiting a college friend, thought she'd swing by and see how I was doing. But I knew Diane. She didn't swing by anywhere. She inspected. She moved through the house the way a detective walks through a crime scene, slowly, deliberately, touching surfaces and cataloging what she found. The white mug with the blue rim, now sitting at eye level, instead of buried on the top shelf. A dog-eared paperback left open on the kitchen table, one of Nora's manuscripts. A pair of small sandals sitting neatly by the back porch door. Diane didn't ask about any of it directly. She was too precise for that. She simply let her gaze rest on each object, one by one, then turned to me with that cool, calibrated smile she wore like armor and said, "Looks like someone's been settling in." I said, "No one's settling in, Diane, and this isn't your place anymore." But Diane was never the kind of person who accepted an answer she hadn't pre-approved. She stood in my kitchen and reached for the white mug. Nora's mug picked it up and rotated it in her hands like she was appraising something at an estate sale. "Pretty cup," she said, tilting it toward the window light. "New?" I reached over without thinking, took it from her fingers, and placed it back on the shelf. A small gesture, barely a second long, but it said everything I didn't have words for, that this mug belonged to someone, and I was protecting it by instinct, the way you pull something fragile away from hands that don't understand what they're holding. Diane never destroyed things with a hammer. She used sandpaper, patient, methodical, working the surface layer by careful layer until all the finish was gone and the raw wood underneath looked ugly and exposed and nothing like what it was meant to be. That was her particular talent. Not cruelty in the obvious sense. Precision. She stayed in Savannah for a few days after that, and somewhere during that window, by coincidence or by careful design, though with Diane there was truly no such thing as coincidence, she found Nora. I wasn't there for it, but Nora told me what happened afterward, in the kind of flat, measured voice people use when they're trying not to let the words cut them on the way out. Diane had pulled up alongside her on the sidewalk near Forsyth Park, rolled down the passenger window, and struck up what passed for friendly conversation. "How long have you been in the neighborhood? Do you know Caleb?" He's a wonderful man, isn't he? And then the turn delivered with a warm, sympathetic tilt of the head, like medicine dissolved in honey so you swallow it before you taste the bitterness. Caleb is a good man, but he doesn't really know how to let anyone in. Not truly. I spent 4 years living with him. Believe me, I would know. She didn't lie. Diane never told an outright lie. She just aimed the truth at the precise angle where it would draw the most blood. Nora vanished for 3 days after that. No visits, no calls, no messages. No sound of her footsteps on my porch in the late afternoon. The white mug sat on its shelf undisturbed, like a small monument to something that had been interrupted. I walked past her house on the second morning, lights burning behind the windows, but curtains pulled shut tight. I knocked that evening, stood on her porch and waited. No answer. I lowered my hand, walked down her steps, and went home through the dark. On the 4th day, Ellen caught me in the driveway loading a finished dresser into my truck bed. She leaned on the fence post, folded her arms across her chest, and said as casually as if she were reporting the weather, "I saw your ex-wife talking to that girl Nora on the street the other day, right there near Forsyth." She didn't add commentary, didn't offer an opinion. She didn't need to. The sentence landed like a dropped stone, and I understood everything it carried inside. I went to Nora's house that same afternoon. She opened the door slowly, holding it halfway, like she wasn't sure she wanted to let the world in just yet. Her eyes weren't red, but she looked hollowed out, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from too little sleep, but from too much thinking, from picking up every word someone said to you and turning it over in your hands, trying to decide which ones were weapons disguised as kindness. I asked her directly, "What did Diane say to you?" She didn't answer right away. She stepped back into the doorway and looked past me for a moment, toward the street, toward the oaks and the parked cars and the nothing beyond them. Then she said quietly, "She didn't say anything wrong. She just said the right things in a way that made everything sound wrong." That sentence hit me in the chest, harder than anything Diane had ever aimed at my face directly, because it was a perfect, airtight description of how Diane had always operated, never a fabrication, never something you could call a lie, just the truth bent and reshaped and angled until it found the softest place it could reach and pushed. I called Diane that night, sat in the kitchen with the phone in my hand and kept my voice as level as I could manage, which required more effort than I'm willing to admit. I told her plainly, "You don't get to talk to anyone about me, not about our marriage, not about who I am, not about what I can or can't do. We are done, Diane, all the way done, not the kind of done where you still reach into my life and rearrange the furniture." She laughed, that short, precise laugh she deployed when she wanted you to feel small, and said, "I was just saving the poor girl some time, Caleb. You really should be thanking me." I hung up, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt genuine, full-body anger, not directed at Diane, but at myself, at the fact that I had allowed the shadow of someone who walked out of this house 2 years ago to still fall across my doorstep, at the power I had handed her by never fully closing the door behind her when she left. 3 days without Nora, and I finally learned just how loud the night crickets really were when there was no one sitting in the chair beside mine. How different the porch swing sounded bearing only one person's weight. How the mug on the shelf stopped looking like a cup and started looking like a question I wasn't confident I'd ever get to answer. Diane's perfume, sharp, expensive, familiar in a way that tightened my jaw, hung in the kitchen air for a full day after she left. Then it faded, and the silence settled back in, and the mug sat perfectly still, and I waited for a knock that might never come. After Diane left Savannah, I gave Nora room. A full week. I told myself it was respect, giving her the space she needed to sort through whatever Diane had so carefully planted in her mind. But honesty demands I admit the other half. Part of it was fear. Fear that Diane's version of me was the accurate one, that maybe I truly didn't know how to let another person close, and the evidence was a 4-year marriage that ended with a woman telling a stranger on the sidewalk that exact thing calmly, confidently, like she was stating the weather. I worked, kept my hands busy and my thoughts on a leash, finished 2 commissions, a rocking chair for a retired couple in Thunderbolt who wanted it for their screened-in porch, and a walnut dresser for a woman on White Marsh Island who was restoring it as a gift for her granddaughter's first apartment. Good, careful, patient work, the kind that fills your hands completely while your mind circles one single thought over and over. like a dog pacing a room it can't find the exit to. Every evening I'd come inside, wash the sawdust from my forearms, pour myself something, and stand in the kitchen looking at the white mug on the shelf. And I'd think, if she doesn't come back, what does this cup become? Just porcelain taking up space? Or a quiet little monument to the thing I almost reached, the thing I was too slow to name before someone else named it wrong for me? Day 8, 9 o'clock at night. A knock at the door, quiet, uncertain. The kind of knock someone makes when they're not sure they should be knocking at all. Nora. She wasn't carrying cookies, wasn't carrying a manuscript or a bottle of wine, or any of the usual props. She was just standing there with her hands clasped together in front of her stomach, exactly the way she'd stood on this very porch that first night. Same held posture, same careful breathing, like if she moved too fast, the courage might slip away before she could use it. I opened the door, stepped aside. She walked in without a word. She sat down at the kitchen table. I filled the white mug with chamomile tea, her kind, the one I'd started keeping stocked without being asked, and set it in front of her. She watched the steam curl and dissolve for a long moment. Then she spoke, slowly, deliberately, each word placed down like something heavy she'd been carrying across a great distance. I didn't come over that night because of Marcus. I mean, we did fight. The argument was real, but that's not why I came to your door. I sat across from her, waited. She took a slow breath and continued. I came because I didn't know anywhere else I wanted to be at 11 o'clock at night, and that scared me. She told me the rest, then everything she'd been keeping behind that calm, careful exterior for over a year. She said she'd felt drawn to me long before that night. Since the afternoon, she'd overheard me talking to Ellen about restoring her late husband's rocking chair. I'd told Ellen I would keep the worn groove on the right armrest, the smooth, shallow dip that his hand had pressed into the wood over 30 years of evenings, because sanding it away would erase the last place the chair still remembered him. Nora had been standing on the other side of the fence, half hidden behind the azalea bushes, listening, and she'd thought, this is the kind of person I want to be near. Someone who believes the marks we leave on things are worth keeping. Someone who doesn't erase what came before just to make the surface look clean. But she never said a word. Not to me, not to anyone, because she was afraid that speaking it out loud would shatter the quiet between us, the easy, unforced rhythm that made being neighbors feel like enough, even on the nights when it clearly wasn't. Even on the evenings she walked home from my porch and stood in her own kitchen and felt the absence settle around her like cold water. The argument with Marcus was real, but it was also the excuse she'd been searching for, the reason she needed to finally cross a threshold she'd been standing at for over a year, looking at my front door, imagining herself knocking and never quite finding the nerve to raise her fist. I sat with that for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked steadily against the wall. The steam rose slow and thin from her mug, twisting in the warm air. Outside, the crickets filled the dark yard with their patient, endless chorus. Then I said, and this was my own confession, the only one I knew how to give, I moved that mug down from the top shelf. I don't remember what day I did it, but I know exactly why. Nora looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us said another word. There are moments when silence holds more truth than any sentence ever assembled. The light fell warm and golden across our hands, resting on the table close together, almost touching, but not quite. And that narrow, charged space between them said everything that needed to be said. She didn't say, I love you. She said, I didn't know anywhere else I wanted to be, and somehow, that sentence carried more weight than 3 small words ever could have. I'd spent 2 years believing that quiet alone was the same as being whole. Nora showed me something I'd missed entirely. Quiet is only enough when someone is being quiet right beside you. We didn't kiss that night. Didn't make any promises. Nora finished her tea. I washed the mug and placed it back on the shelf. She went home, but the next morning she showed up at my door early, hair still damp from a shower. No explanation given or needed, set a paper bag of croissants on the doorstep, and said, eat breakfast. Then she turned and walked back toward her house, and something about the way she said it, easy, unhurried, like she'd already been doing this every morning for years, and fully intended to keep going, told me that the door between us wasn't just open anymore. It was gone. The weeks that followed moved in small, quiet shifts that nobody announced and nobody questioned. Nora started leaving a pair of sandals on my front porch, never mentioned it. Never asked if it was okay. They just appeared one afternoon and stayed, as natural as the welcome mat. The manuscript she was editing migrated gradually from her kitchen table to mine, along with a red pen and a steadily growing colony of sticky notes that claimed the corner near the window. One evening, I was working late in the garage, applying the final coat of lacquer to a church pew from 1938, and Nora came out carrying 2 mugs coffee for me, chamomile for herself. She pulled up the folding chair, sat down beside my workbench, and read her pages while I laid down varnish in long, careful strokes. We didn't exchange a single word for 2 solid hours, and that silence, warm, companionable, full of something neither of us needed to name, was the closest I had ever felt to another human being in my entire life. One night it rained. A real Savannah rain, the kind that turns the streets into shallow rivers within minutes and makes the Spanish moss drip like the oaks themselves are weeping. I was walking home from the workshop I sometimes rent down by the river when Nora came running out of her house with an umbrella. She met me on the sidewalk, breathless, rain already in her hair. But the umbrella was small, barely big enough for one, and when we tried to share it, we both ended up soaked on one shoulder. She laughed, I laughed, and without planning it, without any conscious thought at all, I reached for her hand, not a grip, just a touch. My fingers threading gently through hers, tentative, careful, like testing whether a glued joint is ready to hold weight. She didn't pull away. We walked like that the rest of the way home, rain drumming on the canvas umbrella above us, warm water running in thin lines down our arms. And when we stopped at my front door, she looked up at me, rain on her cheeks and eyelashes, the porch light throwing a warm golden circle behind my head, and I leaned down and kissed her. Soft, slow, like I was afraid she might turn out to be something I'd only dreamed of finding. 6 months later, Nora was still in her house and I was still in mine, but the borders between them had blurred well past any honest recognition. My kitchen cabinet held her chamomile tea and her reading glasses rested on the counter by the stove. Her bookshelf had a bottle of my tongue oil and a square of fine grit sandpaper I'd tucked between 2 novels as a bookmark. We didn't rush. We didn't need the conversation about what we were. We simply were. Diane called one more time during that stretch. I saw her name light up the screen and let it ring out. She sent a text afterward. You'll regret this. I read the message once, deleted it, and felt absolutely nothing at all. Not anger, not grief, not even the low persistent hum of resentment I'd been carrying like a smooth stone in my pocket for 2 solid years. It was simply gone. And that absence, that clean, complete silence in the place where Diane's voice used to echo, was exactly how I knew I'd finally walked all the way through the door and closed it permanently behind me. 1 year later, Nora moved in. There was no moving truck parked at the curb. No official date circled on a calendar. It happened the way dawn happens, so gradually that you cannot point to the single moment when darkness becomes light. A box of paperbacks appeared beside the staircase. A shoe rack materialized by the back door. Her heavy winter coat started hanging next to mine in the hallway closet, until one Saturday morning I stood in the kitchen making coffee and looked around the room and realized, with a quiet shock, that every single thing she owned was already inside these walls. The white porcelain mug with the blue rim now stood on the shelf right beside my black coffee cup, 2 mugs, side by side, filled at the same time every morning like a small, private ceremony neither of us had consciously designed. Marcus came by for lunch that weekend. He stood in the kitchen and saw the 2 cups on the shelf. He looked at them, then at me. He didn't say a word, just nodded, the kind of slow, deliberate nod between men that says everything without making a sound. All right, I see it. I trust you with her. She didn't move in. She just gradually stayed until leaving became more absurd than remaining, and remaining became so natural that neither of us could recall what the house had sounded like without her in it. There were evenings when Nora sat on the porch reading a manuscript under the lamp while I sanded a tabletop out in the garage. We wouldn't speak for hours at a stretch, but every now and then I'd hear her laugh, soft, nearly private, meant for no one in particular, at a passage she especially liked, and that sound would travel across the dark yard, slip through the open workshop door, and land right beside me at my bench. I'd pause, sandpaper still pressed to the wood, and think, this is what Diane never understood, that love doesn't require noise. that the loudest proof of it is two people choosing the same silence, night after night, and finding it full instead of empty. I restore old furniture so other people can hold on to their memories. But Nora taught me that sometimes the most beautiful thing isn't a memory you're carefully preserving behind glass. It's one you're building right now with sawdust on your fingers and tea, going cold on the porch rail, and someone laughing softly in another room at something wonderful you'll never need to hear in order to understand. The rain on the tin porch roof, the smell of morning coffee tangled with chamomile steam, the whisper of pages turning in a dark and quiet house. These were the sounds of the life I very nearly didn't get to have. Looking back now, I think about that night Nora standing on my porch at 11 o'clock, her bag pressed tight against her chest, her eyes asking a question her mouth barely knew how to form. I thought I was giving her a place to sleep for a single night, a couch and a blanket and a door that locked behind her. But she knew. She knew from the very beginning that she wasn't coming for shelter. She was coming because I was the only place she wanted to be. And the courage in that, the real, bone-deep, terrifying courage, was that she stepped through my door without a single guarantee that I would ever understand why she was there. That mug is still on the shelf, every morning right next to mine. Sometimes I wash them both at the same time and stand there with warm water running over my hands and think, this is the thing I almost missed. This whole life, sitting right on the other side of a door I nearly forgot to open. All because I believed that being quiet alone was the same as being at peace. If someone knocks on your door at 11 at night, don't just open it. Look at what they're carrying. Sometimes it isn't a suitcase. Sometimes it's everything they have. Has anyone ever come to find you, and you didn't realize until much later how long they'd been waiting for the courage to knock? And if you were Nora, would you have done it? Would you have knocked? If this story reached something in you, leave a like. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been the one who knocked, or the one who opened the door? And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, hit that button so you don't miss the next story. I'll see you there.